Welcome back. Let's talk about your new project.
Thanks, Janet. I'm thrilled to be here.
The audience is excited. What's new?
The studio lights were bright, the audience was warm, and the tone was meant to be friendly. But within minutes, the energy on the set of The View shifted in a way no one in the room expected. A routine promotional appearance turned into a tense, unscripted exchange that left the table unusually quiet and viewers at home leaning closer to their screens. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Chris Evans was not a stranger to live television. By the time he walked onto the set that morning, he had spent over a decade navigating interviews, press junkets, red carpets, and talk shows across the world. Known for his calm demeanor, thoughtful answers, and careful choice of words, Evans had built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most measured and media-savvy actors. Whether discussing blockbuster films, political advocacy, or personal projects, he rarely allowed interviews to drift off course. Sunny Hostin, on the other hand, was equally known for her direct style. As a co-host of The View, Hostin had built her presence on asking questions that pushed beyond surface-level promotion. With a background in law and journalism, she often steered conversations toward social issues, accountability, and cultural context. Guests on the show understood that appearances were rarely limited to safe publicity rounds. The table had a history of producing moments that felt unscripted, sometimes uncomfortable, and always very real. That morning, the setup appeared ordinary. Evans was there to promote an upcoming project and to discuss his continued involvement in civic engagement and voter education initiatives, topics he had spoken about publicly for years. The audience applauded warmly as he took his seat. Smiles were exchanged. The early questions followed the expected pattern: career highlights, recent roles, and light personal reflections. But what made this appearance different was not something visible at first. It was the direction the conversation would take once it moved away from familiar territory. Live television operates on a delicate balance. There are notes, suggested talking points, and general expectations, but once the cameras are rolling, the dialogue belongs to the moment. Hosts can pivot, guests can respond, and sometimes that natural flow exposes a tension no one anticipated. For Evans, interviews had always been about clarity. He often chose his words carefully when discussing politics or social issues, aware that his platform carried weight. He avoided sensational statements and instead focused on encouraging participation, civic awareness, and respectful dialogue. He had become, in many ways, an example of how a public figure could speak about public issues without escalating controversy. For Hostin, however, conversations about public figures and politics were rarely neutral. She approached them with the instinct of a prosecutor, curious, precise, and unwilling to let answers remain vague. Her audience expected that from her. The show's format encouraged it. As the discussion gradually moved from film to public advocacy, the tone subtly changed. The smiles became more reserved. The rhythm of the conversation slowed. Other co-hosts leaned back slightly, allowing the exchange to unfold more directly between Hostin and Evans. What happened next was not loud. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, no overt conflict. In fact, what made the moment so striking was how quiet it became. Hostin posed a question that reframed Evans' public advocacy in a way he had not been asked before on live television. It was not hostile, but it was pointed. It asked him to reconcile his public messaging with broader questions about celebrity influence, accountability, and whether public figures sometimes oversimplify complex civic issues when addressing large audiences. The audience, which had been lightly laughing moments earlier, went still. Evans paused. That pause, brief but noticeable, changed the atmosphere in the studio. Live television rarely allows for silence. Conversations are fast, timed, and tightly paced. But this silence lingered just long enough for viewers to sense that Evans was carefully choosing how to respond. Not because he was unprepared, but because the framing of the question required more than a rehearsed answer. He looked at Hostin, nodded slightly, and began responding in a tone that was calm but noticeably more deliberate than before. His words reflected thoughtfulness, but also a subtle challenge to the premise of the question itself. Rather than accepting the framing, he gently pushed back, clarifying his intentions and the limits of what he believed celebrities should claim when speaking about public issues. It was not an argument. It was a rare, measured disagreement unfolding in real time. What made the moment compelling was that both participants remained professional, composed, and articulate. Yet, underneath that civility, Viewers could sense that the conversation had crossed into deeper territory than originally planned. The rest of the table remained unusually quiet. There was no attempt to interrupt, redirect, or lighten the mood. The exchange was allowed to breathe. That decision, whether intentional or instinctive, amplified the tension rather than diffusing it. For viewers at home, it felt like watching two intelligent people navigate a delicate boundary between advocacy, responsibility, and perception, without a script to fall back on. And this was happening live. No edits, no retakes, no opportunity to soften the edges later. By the time the segment ended, the energy in the studio had shifted from casual promotion to reflective seriousness. The applause returned, but it sounded different, more respectful than enthusiastic. What most people watching didn't realize was how rare this kind of moment is in daytime television. Talk shows are designed to entertain, inform, and move quickly. They are not designed for extended, unscripted exchanges that require viewers to think carefully about what they're hearing. Yet this brief interaction did exactly that. It raised questions not only about Evans' role as a public advocate, but about the broader relationship between celebrities, media platforms, and public discourse. It highlighted the unique role The View plays in allowing conversations to veer into unexpected territory. And it showed how a single, well-phrased question can alter the direction of an entire interview. But the real impact of the moment would only become clear after the cameras stopped rolling. Because what happened in those few minutes did not stay confined to the studio. Viewers reacted. Clips circulated. Discussions followed. And both Evans and Hostin would find their words examined far beyond the context of the original segment. At the time, though, sitting under those studio lights, neither of them knew that this calm, thoughtful exchange would become one of the most discussed portions of the episode. And the most revealing part of it had not even happened yet.
Chris, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So tell us about the new project.
Before that morning's appearance, Chris Evans' public image had been shaped as much by what he said off-screen as by the roles he played on-screen. Over the years, he had stepped beyond the boundaries of typical celebrity interviews and into conversations about civic participation, media literacy, and respectful political engagement. His project focused on encouraging Americans to understand the mechanics of government and to participate thoughtfully in the democratic process. He was careful not to endorse specific candidates on television, but he consistently emphasized the importance of informed citizenship. This approach earned him admiration from many viewers who saw him as a celebrity willing to use his platform responsibly. At the same time, it placed him in a delicate position. The more he spoke about civic issues, the more interviewers felt compelled to explore what that advocacy truly meant. Was he simply encouraging participation, or was he shaping opinions? Was his messaging neutral, or did it carry implied viewpoints? These questions had followed Evans quietly for years, but they were rarely asked directly in live interviews. Most hosts treated his advocacy as an admirable side note rather than a subject for examination. Sunny Hostin, however, did not tend to leave such topics unexplored. Her background as a federal prosecutor and legal analyst gave her a habit of looking beyond surface statements. She was accustomed to listening for what wasn't being said as much as what was. On The View, she often acted as the voice that slowed conversations down and pushed for clarity when discussions touched on social or political issues. The show itself had a long history of navigating this space. Unlike many daytime programs that leaned entirely toward entertainment, The View had built its identity on the intersection of pop culture and public discourse. Celebrities who appeared on the show often found themselves discussing topics they might not encounter elsewhere: race, justice, politics, media responsibility, and cultural influence. For Evans, this was familiar territory, but the context mattered. A press junket or a late-night show offered a different atmosphere than a table discussion on The View. Here, the conversation wasn't one-on-one. It was dynamic, unpredictable, and shaped by multiple perspectives at once. The hosts didn't simply ask questions. They responded, challenged, and built on each other's points. In the days leading up to the appearance, Evans had been promoting a new project, but he had also recently participated in interviews where he discussed the importance of combating misinformation and encouraging civic awareness. Clips of those interviews had circulated widely on social media. In them, he spoke calmly about how citizens should engage with news sources, understand how government functions, and avoid reducing complex issues to slogans. To many viewers, these comments were thoughtful and measured. To others, they raised questions about how celebrities frame civic responsibility when speaking to millions of followers. Some critics suggested that even neutral messaging can carry unintended influence when delivered by a beloved public figure. These undercurrents formed the quiet backdrop to his appearance on The View. Sunny Hostin was aware of this context. She had referenced similar issues in previous episodes when discussing the role of public figures in political conversations. She often emphasized the difference between encouraging awareness and unintentionally shaping narratives. Her interest was not in criticizing celebrities for speaking out, but in examining how influence works in modern media. When Evans walked onto the set, none of this tension was visible. The audience saw a familiar actor promoting his work. The early conversation stayed comfortably within that frame. But for those familiar with Hostin's interviewing style, there were small signals that the discussion might move deeper. She listened closely as Evans described his recent efforts to encourage civic participation. She nodded as he spoke about wanting people to feel empowered rather than overwhelmed by political systems. She allowed him to finish his thoughts without interruption. But her follow-up questions grew more precise. Rather than asking why he felt passionate about these issues, she began asking how he ensured that his messaging remained balanced. Rather than focusing on his intentions, she shifted toward the effect of his words on audiences who might interpret them in different ways. This was subtle but important. The conversation was moving from what Evans was doing to how it might be perceived. The rest of the table sensed the shift. Co-hosts who had been engaging playfully became quieter, allowing the exchange to unfold more directly. The energy of the segment slowed. There was no tension yet, but there was a growing sense that the discussion was becoming more analytical than promotional. Evans responded comfortably at first. He explained that he tried to avoid telling people what to think and instead focused on encouraging them to seek reliable information. He emphasized that his goal was not to influence opinions, but to promote participation. Hostin listened carefully. Then she introduced a perspective that reframed the conversation. She noted that even encouraging participation can carry weight when it comes from a celebrity with a massive following. She asked whether he felt any responsibility for how his words might be interpreted by people who look up to him not just as an actor, but as a trusted voice. This was not a confrontational question. It was thoughtful and measured, but it placed Evans in a position where he had to consider not only his intentions, but the broader implications of his platform. For a moment, the conversation felt less like a promotional interview and more like a public discussion about media responsibility. The audience, initially relaxed, began to listen more closely. This was no longer background television. It required attention. Evans acknowledged the point. He agreed that public figures must be careful. But he also gently suggested that withholding encouragement for civic engagement out of fear of misinterpretation could lead to silence, which he believed was more harmful. This exchange laid the groundwork for what would follow. Hostin's next question built directly on this foundation. It would move from theory to a more personal examination of Evans' role in these conversations. It would ask him to address the tension between influence and intention in a way he had not yet been asked to do on live television. The timing of the question, coming after several minutes of thoughtful dialogue, made it feel natural rather than abrupt. But its framing would change the tone of the entire segment, because it was no longer about general principles. It was about him.
Welcome back. Today we have the amazing Chris Evans.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here with you.
We're thrilled.
The shift happened in a matter of seconds, but it felt much longer to anyone watching closely. Sunny Hostin leaned slightly forward, her hands resting calmly on the table, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. Her voice did not rise. In fact, it softened. That softness made the question land with even greater weight. She asked Chris Evans whether he believed there was a line between encouraging civic participation and unintentionally shaping how people think about political issues, especially when that encouragement comes from someone whose public image carries trust, admiration, and emotional connection for millions of people. There was no accusation in her tone, but the framing of the question placed Evans in a position where a simple, familiar answer would no longer be sufficient. For the first time in the interview, Evans did not respond immediately. He paused. It was a brief pause, but in the rhythm of live television, it stood out. The studio, moments earlier filled with light conversation and soft laughter, went noticeably quiet. The audience stopped shifting in their seats. Even the other co-hosts remained still, allowing the silence to settle. Evans looked at Hostin, nodded once, and exhaled slightly before speaking. He began carefully, acknowledging the legitimacy of the concern. He said that he understood how easily public messages could be interpreted in ways he never intended. He explained that his goal had always been to emphasize participation, not persuasion. His words were measured, deliberate, and thoughtful. But as he continued, something subtle changed. Rather than simply accepting the premise of the question, Evans began to gently challenge it. He suggested that encouraging people to learn about how their government works and to participate in the democratic process should not be viewed as shaping opinions, but as strengthening the foundation for individuals to form their own views. He spoke about the importance of trust in audiences, the idea that people are capable of thinking for themselves without being overly influenced by who delivers the message. His tone remained calm, but there was now a quiet firmness behind it. Hostin listened without interruption. Her expression remained attentive, analytical. She nodded slightly as he spoke, but she did not interject. The rest of the table stayed silent. Evans continued, explaining that if public figures avoided encouraging civic awareness out of fear of overstepping, they might contribute to a culture where disengagement becomes normal. He said he believed that promoting understanding was different from promoting ideology. It was here that Hostin responded. She acknowledged his point, but added another layer. She noted that audiences often blur the line between a celebrity's personal views and the messages they promote. She asked whether he felt that his public persona, built over years of playing heroic, trustworthy characters, might make people more likely to internalize his words as guidance rather than suggestion. Again, the question was not hostile, but it was precise. Evans paused a second time. This pause was even more noticeable than the first. He looked briefly toward the audience, then back at Hostin. His expression was thoughtful, slightly serious, but never defensive. He admitted that he had not always considered how deeply audiences might connect his roles with his real-life opinions. He said that was something he was still learning to navigate. The honesty of that admission changed the energy in the room. What had started as a conceptual discussion now felt personal and reflective. Viewers could sense that Evans was thinking through the implications in real time, rather than delivering a prepared answer. Hostin thanked him for that reflection, but she did not let the moment pass. She followed with a final observation that brought the conversation to its most delicate point. She said that many viewers appreciate celebrities speaking out, but others feel overwhelmed by the constant presence of public figures in political and civic discussions. She asked whether he worried that even well-intentioned advocacy could contribute to fatigue or resistance among audiences who simply want to separate entertainment from public issues. This question lingered. The studio was completely still. Evans responded slowly. He acknowledged that some people do feel that way. He said he understood the desire to keep entertainment separate from politics. But he also said he believed that being a citizen does not stop when someone becomes an actor, and that using a platform responsibly sometimes means accepting that not everyone will welcome it. There was no tension in his voice, but there was conviction. For a brief moment, the exchange felt less like an interview and more like a public dialogue between two thoughtful individuals trying to define the boundaries of influence in modern media. No one interrupted. No one rushed the conversation forward. The silence between sentences became part of the moment. The audience, which had started the segment expecting light promotion, now found itself witnessing a careful, unscripted exploration of celebrity responsibility, media perception, and civic engagement, all unfolding live without edits. Hostin nodded again, acknowledging his perspective. She thanked him for being willing to engage with the questions so openly. Her tone remained respectful, but viewers could sense that the exchange had reached a point rarely seen in daytime television. Evans smiled slightly, but it was a reflective smile rather than a promotional one. As the segment moved toward its close, the rest of the co-hosts gently re-entered the conversation, shifting the tone back toward lighter territory. But the energy in the studio had already changed. The earlier warmth had been replaced with a quieter, more thoughtful atmosphere. When the applause came, it sounded different, measured, appreciative, almost contemplative. What made the moment remarkable was not conflict, but clarity. Two people had navigated a difficult topic on live television without raising their voices, without deflecting, and without turning the exchange into spectacle. And yet, for viewers watching at home, it was impossible to ignore how rare it felt. Just before the cameras cut away, Hostin offered a final comment about the importance of these kinds of conversations. Evans nodded in agreement. But what neither of them could see yet was how quickly this calm, thoughtful exchange would travel far beyond the studio walls. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator for more deep dives into the moments television didn't expect you to notice. As the segment ended and the cameras shifted focus, the studio did not immediately return to its earlier energy. There was no quick laughter, no casual chatter breaking the tension. Instead, there was a quiet reset, an unspoken recognition that something more substantial than a routine interview had just taken place. The applause faded more quickly than usual. Audience members who had been smiling moments before now looked thoughtful, some leaning toward one another to exchange brief comments. It was the kind of reaction that follows a meaningful conversation rather than an entertaining one. At the table, the co-hosts subtly adjusted their posture. A few exchanged glances that suggested awareness of what had just unfolded. Not discomfort, but recognition. The discussion had ventured into territory that daytime television rarely explores so deliberately and calmly. Sunny Hostin maintained her composed expression. She did not appear rattled or defensive. Instead, she looked reflective, as though she too was processing the exchange in real time. Her role had been to ask careful questions, and she had done so without escalation. Yet the weight of the conversation lingered in the air. Chris Evans leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but his expression thoughtful. The promotional tone he had carried onto the set had been replaced by something more contemplative. He smiled politely as the show transitioned, but it was clear that his focus had shifted from presenting a project to engaging in a deeper dialogue. Behind the scenes, production staff moved as they always did between segments, but even their movements felt quieter. The rhythm of the show had been interrupted in a way that could not simply be smoothed over with a commercial break. When the program resumed, the hosts gently steered the conversation toward lighter topics, as is typical in live television after an intense moment. But viewers who had been watching from the beginning could sense the difference. The tone had changed, and it did not fully return to what it had been. What stood out most was how carefully everyone handled the transition. No one made jokes about the previous exchange. No one tried to trivialize it. There was an unspoken agreement to respect what had occurred. For Evans, the aftermath was immediate but subtle. As the show moved forward, he spoke less, allowing the hosts to guide the discussion. When he did respond, his answers were shorter, more reflective, as though he was still mentally revisiting the earlier questions. Hostin, too, appeared more measured. She did not revisit the topic, but her demeanor suggested that she understood the significance of the moment. She had asked questions that required thoughtful answers, and she had received them. There was no need to push further. In the control room, producers monitored social media in real time, as they often do during live broadcasts. They began noticing an unusual spike in comments referencing the exchange. Viewers were not discussing the promotional aspects of the segment. They were discussing the conversation itself. Clips began circulating almost immediately. Short excerpts of the pauses, the careful responses, and the questions that reframed the discussion started appearing online before the episode had even finished airing in some regions. What people were sharing was not conflict, but the rarity of what they had witnessed, a calm, respectful, unscripted exploration of celebrity influence on live daytime television. By the time Evans left the set, the impact was already spreading beyond the studio. Staff members thanked him as they always did, but several remarked quietly on how thoughtful the segment had been. It was not the typical feedback given after a celebrity appearance. Outside the studio, media outlets that regularly cover daytime television began taking note. Not because of controversy, but because the exchange felt meaningful. In an environment where interviews often follow predictable patterns, this one had deviated in a way that felt authentic. For the audience at home, the moment lingered long after the program ended. Many viewers replayed the clip to listen again to the pauses, the tone, and the careful wording from both Evans and Hostin. It invited reflection rather than reaction. Within hours, commentary began appearing online. Some praised Hostin for asking questions that moved beyond surface-level conversation. Others commended Evans for responding with honesty and composure rather than defensiveness. The discussion was not polarized, it was analytical. What surprised many observers was how the moment resisted being simplified into a headline. There was no argument to summarize, no outburst to replay. The significance lay in the nuance. Back on set, as the show wrapped for the day, the hosts gathered their notes and prepared to leave. There was a quiet professionalism in the way they moved, but also a sense that they had participated in something slightly different from the usual rhythm of live television. Hostin reportedly reflected with colleagues on how rare it is for a guest to engage so thoughtfully without attempting to redirect or deflect. Evans, for his part, left the studio with the same calm demeanor he had arrived with. But those who spoke with him noticed he seemed more introspective than before. Neither of them had raised their voices. Neither had lost composure. Yet the exchange had clearly left an impression on everyone present. The studio lights dimmed. The set emptied. But the conversation that had unfolded under those lights was only beginning to take on a life of its own beyond the walls of the building. And in the days that followed, its significance would become even clearer. In the days following the broadcast, the exchange between Chris Evans and Sunny Hostin did something unusual for a daytime talk show moment. It continued to circulate, not as a viral argument, not as a sensational headline, but as a clip people shared when they wanted to point to what thoughtful television could look like. Short segments of the conversation appeared across social media platforms, often accompanied by captions noting the silence in the room, the careful wording, and the rare sight of a celebrity and a host engaging in a genuine, unscripted discussion about responsibility and influence. Viewers replayed the pauses as much as the answers. They listened closely to tone, rather than searching for dramatic sound bites. Media commentators picked up on the moment, not because it was explosive, but because it resisted simplification. Articles and opinion pieces referenced the exchange as an example of how talk shows can create space for meaningful dialogue without descending into confrontation. It became a case study in how live television can still surprise audiences without relying on conflict. For Evans, the moment blended into his broader public image in a subtle but important way. He did not issue statements afterward. He did not reference the exchange in subsequent interviews. But viewers who followed his appearances began to notice a slightly more reflective quality when he spoke about civic engagement. He continued to advocate for participation, but he also acknowledged more frequently the complexity of influence and perception. The conversation had not changed his message. It had added depth to how people understood it. For Hostin, the segment reinforced something longtime viewers of The View already knew. Her strength as an interviewer lies not in creating dramatic television, but in asking questions that require careful thought. Many viewers praised her for maintaining a respectful tone while guiding the discussion into meaningful territory. The moment highlighted the balance she often brings to the table: curious, precise, and composed. The exchange also reminded audiences of the unique space The View occupies in daytime television. It is one of the few platforms where celebrities can be asked questions that extend beyond promotion without the conversation feeling out of place. That identity, built over years, allowed this moment to unfold naturally rather than feeling forced. What made the segment endure was not what was said alone, but how it was said. The calm pacing, the mutual respect, and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable questions created an atmosphere that viewers found refreshing. In a media environment often dominated by quick reactions and loud debates, this quiet, deliberate exchange felt different. Over time, the clip continued to resurface whenever discussions arose about the role of celebrities in public discourse. Educators referenced it in media studies classes. Commentators used it as an example of how interviews can move beyond scripted promotion. Viewers returned to it as a reminder that meaningful conversation can exist on mainstream television. The moment also contributed to a broader cultural reflection. It raised questions about how audiences interpret messages from public figures, how media platforms shape conversations, and how intention and perception can differ in complex ways. These were not new questions, but seeing them explored live, without rehearsal, gave them renewed relevance. Neither Evans nor Hostin appeared to treat the exchange as extraordinary in public comments. They both continued their work as they always had. But for those who watched closely, the segment remained memorable precisely because it did not feel staged. It felt human. It showed two professionals navigating a nuanced topic with care. It showed how silence can carry as much meaning as speech. And it showed that sometimes the most impactful television moments are the ones that unfold quietly, without spectacle. Years from now, viewers may not remember the specific project Evans was promoting that day. They may not recall the lighter moments from the episode. But many will remember the calm stillness that settled over the studio when a thoughtful question met an equally thoughtful answer. That is what gave the moment its lasting power. It was not about confrontation. It was about clarity. Moments like this remind us why live television still matters. There are no retakes, no edits, and no scripts to hide behind. There is only the conversation as it happens, shaped by the people in the room and the honesty they bring to it. And when those conversations are handled with respect, they leave a mark that extends far beyond the broadcast. If you appreciate deep dives into the television moments most people overlook, subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with others who value thoughtful storytelling.